Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I am very, very excited and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by being here today. So, if you are fully caught up with this season of Reading Michael Jackson, you know that last week we wrapped reading Moonwalk. And honestly, I cannot believe that I read an entire book out loud to strangers around the whole world. You know, it's kind of cool to reflect on that now that we're officially finished with the book. So, there is a lot that I want to talk about today and a lot that I want to cover. As a recap, my initial reason for choosing Moonwalk at this moment in this time, obviously a podcast called Reading Michael Jackson. Michael released 2 books in his lifetime, and one of them is Moonwalk. So of course this is one that would be covered, right? But I specifically wanted to read this book leading up to the biopic. And so what I want to do today is talk first about the book itself as a standalone entity, you know, and then I want to talk about it in tandem with the biopic in terms of, based on this book, what can or should we expect or hope to see in the biopic. So sort of imagining this in 2 separate parts. So part 1, let's talk about Moonwalk in reflection. So we started reading Moonwalk, I guess officially in December of 2025, but the full season really launched in the first week of January of 2026. So we are now 4 months later finishing it. If you've been here the whole time, you have listened to me talk for literally hours, in some cases, every week about this book and Michael. So you may be wondering, what is there still to say? Well, that never ends when it comes to me, I'll be honest. I always have new thoughts. And actually, I was editing the last episode, and when I was editing it, I thought, God, I really didn't do a good job with this one. Now, hopefully you didn't feel that way as listeners, but there was so much I felt while editing that I wish I would have commented on. And perhaps I will circle back to some of that today, since the final chapter and the final pages kind of sum up, I think, Michael's purpose in writing this book and releasing this book. So as we're about to get into my review of this book, I can't help but think, like, what was your experience of listening to this book the last 4 months, of breaking it down so slowly and in such depth every single week? I'm wondering, you know, if you have read this book before, how did the experience differ for you this time around? If you've never read it before, what was it like to read it in this way? And did you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with some of my commentary? You know, these are things that I want to mention up front because, of course, we're different people. And while you may jump on board with and agree with things that I say and I share, it's very likely and possible you will have read things differently than me and will have gained something different from this book than I provided and I suggested. So I want to keep that in the forefront of your mind as we get into my review, because this book and reading about Michael's life is not an easy thing. Michael had a lot of challenges in his life, especially in the time frame that this book covers in his younger years. And there's a lot we learn about. I mean, again, if you've never read it before, you definitely learned a lot about this. But even just with a closer reading, I think there's things we can learn about that maybe we missed the first time around. So there's a lot of heaviness to Michael's life. And the crazy part is this is only, you know, the first half or a little over the first half of his life. So it doesn't even get to the crazy and really, really heavy stuff. You know, that's all coming, unfortunately, in the 90s. So I hope you have spent some time reflecting on what you think of this book and what you got from it. I want to say also that at some point in this review, I am going to share some details of reviews that I read about the book to prepare for today's episode, because I always thought it would be interesting to share perspectives of how the media responded to and spoke about this book, either when it was released initially in 1988, when it was re-released in 2009, or even in more recent years. I recently bought a magazine at Barnes & Noble that was just put out, and it's called, I think, The Ultimate Fan Guide to Michael Jackson. And it's put out, of course, because of the biopic. And I bought it because, from what I could tell, especially in comparison to the other magazines that have come out recently about Michael, it is one of the more respectful ones. I mean, it is, hailing itself as a fan guide. But I bought it also because I just wanted to spend time reading it more closely. And as I read all of it a few days ago, I noted that the most frequently referenced source throughout it was Michael Jackson himself in writing Moonwalk. So I found that really interesting, especially because it reminded me of how infrequently, when we read about Michael Jackson in magazines or just like any coverage in the media, it's so infrequent that he himself is quoted, and I find that kind of interesting and in line with things I've complained about, honestly, this whole season, when it comes to why so many people default to others' words about Michael rather than Michael's words about himself. Either way, I do intend to touch upon some of these reviews because I want to keep those reviews in mind in how we process the book we read, but also in how we prepare for the biopic ahead of us. Because it is very likely to me that the mainstream media's approach to reviewing this book will be very similar to their approach to reviewing Michael, the film. So I will get into all of that a little bit later, but that's a little bit of a heads up for what is to come. So when we want to review this and think about this book, not just in terms of, we're Michael Jackson fans and we love learning about him and anything to do with him, frankly, how does it stand in terms of a memoir or an autobiography? So I want to be clear about something first. People often use these terms memoir and autobiography interchangeably. Technically, that is okay, but there's a little bit more nuance to it. An autobiography typically covers a person's entire life, whereas a memoir might cover a segment of a life or a specific theme of a life or a time period in someone's life. So, for example, a person might write a memoir about a particular period of time, working in the Peace Corps or something, and the entire story is primarily centered around that, with very little going outside of it. That would be a memoir because it's much more pointed and focused on a specific period of time. However, an autobiography or a biography should cover the length of a person's life. It shouldn't just be as much about a particular snippet of time. It's meant to be biographical in that it covers the biographical information of our lives, the main dates, the main events, the main components, all the major players in our lives, our families, our loved ones, etc. So these are very distinct genres, despite the fact that they kind of come together. So with that difference, autobiographies or biographies are, generally speaking, less emotionally resonant. Usually they give a little bit less personal insight because they're covering a longer period of time. So they don't necessarily dig as deep into deep emotional aspects of a person's life. They don't necessarily or always get into the nitty-gritty, you might say. Whereas a memoir, because it's more focused and there's more time spent, it is understandable that you would get and expect to get more detail. You can kind of look at it like an autobiography is a snapshot of an entire scene, and a memoir is a zoomed in photo of, one corner of the overall frame. The closer you get, the more limited your view is, the more you can see in some cases, right? So I would definitely, with this in mind, consider this book an autobiography. Now, I may still, and people may still use these terms interchangeably, and that's fine, but I think it's important we remember that when we talk about the book. So there were 6 chapters in this book. Chapter 1 covered Michael's childhood up until auditioning for Motown. Chapter 2 covered the Motown years. Chapter 3 covered the transition from Motown to Epic, as well as Michael's experience filming The Wiz. Chapter 4 covered Michael's collaboration with Quincy Jones and Off the Wall. Chapter 5 covered his collaboration with Quincy on Thriller and debuting the Moonwalk. And Chapter 6 covered everything after. So I took it upon myself to flip back through these pages and just get a sense of how much of the book was spent where. Chapter 1 is the longest chapter by quite a bit. Chapter 1 is 60 pages long. And this is the chapter, like I said, that covers his childhood, his pre-Motown years. Now, as we may remember throughout this book, Michael kind of, as I've said many times, sort of meanders in and out of different times and thoughts. So when I say that each of these chapters covered those distinct time periods, there was of course pages where he dipped out of that time period to talk about a relationship or to talk about a future performance or his philosophy on something, or, you know, how in love he was with Diana Ross or whatever. So it's not as if this is 100% chronological, but it gives you a general, sense of where the time and the pages were spent. So chapter 1 is the longest chapter though. In chapter 1, I would say, in chapter 2, the years where Michael is working as a child are where I think we get the most revelation from Michael. This is where we learn about his challenges with his father, about the discipline, you might even say abuse, he experienced with his father, where we learn about his early exposures to sexuality that he really was too young to see when it came to performing in nightclubs and around strippers and things like that. We learn about his serious struggle with how hard he worked and how long he worked and how very little he had of his own life outside of his career during these times. So we spent a lot of time in this book getting deeper here. But as we pass through, we get more and more that we're compressing into these chapters, which meant as the book progressed, in a lot of ways, it got less personal. By the time we reach chapter 5, chapter 6, we're almost entirely talking about Michael's career with much, much less insight into his personal life, his struggles, his life outside of the recording studio and touring. Now, there's a lot I think we could say about why that is, and I want to offer a couple thoughts here. It could be that Michael really was so involved in his career and so consumed that there wasn't quite as much to share or that he felt comfortable with sharing. I think it is more likely that there were things he was not ready to share and talk about and that felt too revealing. So there's this, I think I talked about this at some point early on in one of the first episodes, but when I have studied and taught about these subjects, I have often reminded students, and I've reminded myself, that there's a reason the majority of memoirs or autobiographies are written by people over 40, usually in the later half of someone's life. And it's not just because you have more life to live and reflect on. It's because your level of comfort in what you share, your insight into how you understand the things you experienced, all of those things change shape as you get older. And I say that as someone who is currently under 40 and who has released a book that is in large part stemming off of my life and my life experience. So I'm coming from that perspective when I talk about this. But when Michael is reflecting on his childhood and his teen years, these are periods of his life that he has had maybe 20 years, maybe 15 years to reflect on, to understand, to make sense of, to develop some understanding of, and how those things affected his life. But when he writes about things that happened 5 years earlier, or 3 years earlier, or a year earlier, we're not going to get the same level of depth or insight. It's just not really that possible. Not only because a person needs the time and space and maturity to look back on certain time periods in your life to really, have something to say about them, but also you need distance to be comfortable sharing things. I mean, there's things that I'm currently going through that I want to write about, but that I don't feel prepared to do that with, especially if it were to come to publishing something. Some things need more time to marinate. I think it's very likely that was what was going on here with Michael. So I just want to say that as we go through this, while in a lot of ways there is a page balance where we have up to page 42 or 43 with essentially Michael being underage, and pages 145 to 283 with Michael being an adult, it seems balanced, you know what I mean? But in a lot of ways, it's not really, because there's a lot more he may want to fill us in on in the later chapters in terms of his life and things that he expects fans and readers will want to hear about. But the actual depth and space to go into those things, it changes a little bit, you know? So all of this is to say that for me, as I read this book the last 4 months, and each week we would get to a new section, I found that when I started reading the book, I was just so emotional, so consumed with concern for Michael and the things I was learning about him. And again, I've read this book several times before this, but I was being reminded of things that I've sort of forgotten, or things that I didn't spend as much time to sit and really examine and think about. And then as we progressed toward the later chapters and the later sections, there was less of that for me, which is not so much meant as a complaint about the book, but one thing I think certainly plays a role in how I received the book. I'm really mentioning all of this because I have never spent so much time reading a book like this. I mean, every time I've read Moonwalk prior to this, I've read it in, a few days, maybe a week at most, but I've read it relatively quickly. And in this reading, I've read it over the course of 4 months. So if I were to reflect on the book now versus 2 months ago, my response might be a little bit different. That's why I'm mentioning all of this. Like, my experience of this book was that I felt more connected to the first half and less connected to the second half. And when I say connected, what I mean by that is I felt emotional resonance more to the first half than the second half. For me, I believe that is in the design of how the book is written. Not that that was the intention, of course, but just the nature of writing about things we have more insight into and time away from, and things that we have experienced more recently or maybe are a little bit more reserved about. I want to be very clear that I absolutely love this book. So when I'm saying this, it's not a criticism of the book as a whole. It's not me saying I don't enjoy it. It's more just, we're teasing out how do we talk about and think about this book? And this is my perspective on it. So when I think about the strengths of this book, much of my memory and association with the strongest, most powerful moments of this book are in the earlier chapters, when we are learning about specifically Michael's relationship with his family, his upbringing, and his early exposure to life and the world in his early years of touring. So we learn in the early chapters about Michael's fear of his father, his desire to please him and do well, largely coming from a place of fear as his father watched them perform with a belt in his hand, and led to this feeling of unrest and discomfort with his father. This is a through line as we move through the entire book, even into the later chapters, when Michael reflects on his father being someone who looks uncomfortable when they're all hugging and won't participate when the emotion's there, or the difficult decision to have to fire his dad and let go of him as his manager, and, not being sure if their relationship is okay, and wishing he knew his father differently. This is something that kind of comes up throughout the whole book, but it starts early on. Still, there is also a sort of reverence in which Michael speaks about his father at times. So he talks about how intelligent his father was, how intuitive he was when it came to music, how open-minded he was about performing more popular, younger kind of sounds than the music that adults at that age were more interested in. His willingness to work them hard and to push them, as well as the fact that he did provide for them and he had great faith in them. Something I always remember when I think about the complication of Joe Jackson is the memory Michael shares, the earliest memories of his father. He says, "The earliest memories I have of my father are of him coming home from the steel mill with a big bag of glazed donuts for all of us. My brothers and I could really eat back then, and that bag would disappear with the snap of the fingers. He used to take us all to the merry-go-round in the park, but I was so young I don't remember that very well." So it's clear, I think, that Michael's relationship and memory of and understanding of his father is very complicated. And he establishes this in the first 10 or so pages of the book. He also establishes very early on that he doesn't feel his own age. And that is a narrative that in one form or another would stick with Michael until the day he died, until now, with a lot of people saying he was a child inside. But Michael straight up telling us in the very early pages of chapter 1 that he actually feels like a very old soul. And then he later says he feels like he's 80 years old. He feels so much older than his age because of the amount of life he lived and how long he worked. So we have multiple early narratives Michael is setting here for us that are very interesting. Complicated relationship with his dad, complicated relationship with his own age and maturity and view of life, where Michael sees himself and feels that he is well beyond his years and is experienced well beyond his years. He also reveals that he felt incredibly experienced in some aspects of life and incredibly inexperienced in others, where he may have had the experiences of traveling the world, of performing, of having the pressure of an entire family's future on his back, but he didn't know what it was like to play with friends or have a sleepover or connect more personally with people. So early on in these first few chapters, and really the first half of the book, we get a lot of those insights. And I think that's where a lot of the strengths in the book lie, in Michael giving us enough context early on without any sense of defensiveness, any sense of trying to explain away something about himself that's misunderstood. Just this, what feels to be authentic revelation about his own challenges, whatever they are. He continues with these kinds of revelations as he gets older. And so chapters 3 and forward, when he starts talking about and revealing more about his insecurities about himself, about his appearance, about his own shyness, about his inability to connect with people the way he wants to. These are really important threads of Michael's life also. And it's difficult for me to some degree because I don't know that someone's appearance changing over their lifetime should be such an integral part of their story. And sometimes I wonder, is it that integral? Is it that important that Michael's appearance changed? Everyone's appearance changes, after all. We all grow, we all age. Some of us gain and lose weight. We dye our hair. We do all kinds of things. We experiment with our style. We develop disabilities. There's so many things that can happen to a human body, to a human face. So many things that can change the way we look. So why is that such an integral part of Michael's story and what people want to know about and people expect to hear about? I often think about this, and the conclusion I'm coming to in this moment is that it matters not because Michael having some insecurities and pursuing changes to his appearance because of them is the most important thing about him, but it matters because of the way the world reacted to him and the way the world treated him in response to his appearance changing. When we are forced and have been forced, both as individuals, but also just as a larger culture, to think about and reflect on Michael's changing appearance as much as we have been, we are naturally going to form our own judgments about that. And I'm not saying judgments in the sense that we are going to look down on him for it necessarily. I think that's very dependent on the person and on what you've consumed and just kind of who you are. But we're going to have a perspective there. We're going to either feel sorry for him, like, oh, it's so sad that Michael was insecure and changed his appearance, or, oh, it's so understandable that Michael did because of this, or, oh, Michael was so flawed, or, he shouldn't have done those things. If only he had done something different. The less cynical part of me feels that when we try to understand this side of him, it comes from just our desire to make sense of something that to us doesn't make sense. Especially when you're a fan of him, if you find him beautiful, you want to understand why his appearance changed, getting explanation from him, maybe that's validating in some way to you. But I also think that to some degree, the world at large has always felt justified in mocking Michael and making light of his pain, making fun of his pain, making fun of him in his changing appearance. When people don't understand something, they feel justified to criticize it. And when people feel entitled to someone and their image, their story, their whatever, there's a resentment when they don't share everything. I mean, it's this kind of vicious cycle, I think, where the public falls in love with someone. The public develops a great sense of interest in them that sort of morphs into this idea of we own you, you owe us something, you owe us a certain type of look, type of behavior, a type of pleasure, a type of attractiveness, a type of, satisfaction that the public then feels entitled to. And when a person distorts that in literally any way, then they can turn on them. And I think that is maybe to some degree a human impulse, but also it's a media-fed impulse for sure. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track here, but I'm feeling a little bit like, the things that are strengths in this book, like us learning about Michael's past pain, his trauma from his upbringing, his insecurities, these are things that can be satisfying to learn about when you are interested in Michael Jackson, because they not only help us fill in the context of who we know him to be, but they, to some degree, satisfy our thirst for intimacy with someone we really don't have any access to otherwise, which is sort of what, a celebrity memoir, autobiography, or whatever is sort of mimicking. This idea that you can be let into their minds and see something real, when ultimately what we're reading is a curated and edited book, Anyway, all of this is to kind of preface what I would say are, for me, the weaknesses of the book. And the weaknesses for me are that as the book progresses, as I've sort of said already, as the book progresses, it becomes less personal and a little bit more focused on checking off boxes, making sure you're covering, let's talk about this music video, let's talk about this song, let's talk about this tour, people want to know about this, let's make sure we mention We Are the World, all those types of things where it's like the insights we get into them are not as significant, but he does still mention them. It satisfies our curiosity to know that they're acknowledged, these things that we as fans, as the public, whatever, participate in as consumers of his art, but it doesn't go much deeper than that in certain places. That to me would be the overall weakness of the book. It's most highlighted in the end sections, I would say in chapter 6 especially, where we're just very, very rushed, but it's also something, we note throughout the book as a whole, when certain moments and certain things, even from the beginning, are kind of brushed past. So part of the question to me when you review a piece of work, whether it's a book like this or anything else, is to assess the effectiveness of the book, to assess if it achieved what it was set out to achieve. And in a little bit, I am going to share those reviews that I mentioned because I think that they are interesting and insightful, and we'll use them as a springboard for jumping into talking about the biopic. But I think something we should all consider when it comes to reviewing the book or the film or anything else is there is, of course, something to be said for craft in terms of assessing some objective measure of quality. How well written was something? How well executed was something on a craft level? But then there is the fact that for every piece of writing, for every film produced, there is an intended audience. And it is always possible that even the very best of something is not going to be loved or liked or even appreciated if it is the wrong audience responding to it. And I think some people would argue that something should stand alone without audience, but as someone who has spent my entire life studying writing and communication, and what makes something effective is that when it comes to communication, whatever the format that is in, whether it's art or anything else, one of the most important factors for consideration when it comes to analysis and effectiveness is first identifying who is the audience for this. It is very, very rare that an audience can be all-inclusive to just anyone. Now, granted, I think that was the goal for this book, and I think that was Michael's goal as a whole when it came to being an artist. Overall, I think as an artist, I think Michael obviously achieved that. He was able to appeal to people of all different demographics, ages, races, ethnicities, you name it. He was able to appeal to it. But Michael, as an artist, is a rare being. Most artists have their audience, they have their one lane, and it doesn't mean they're not good. It doesn't mean, it doesn't even talk about quality necessarily. It just means they know how to appeal to their audience. Anytime we're writing something or creating something, we have an ideal audience in mind, and our ideal audience will respond to and understand what we're trying to get across. And when we curate and we revise and we edit and we compose and all of the different steps that go into something, when we do that, we are doing that with our intended audience in mind, typically. So I'm saying all of this to first say, who is the intended audience of this book? Like I said, I think the goal is that the audience of this book is anyone in the global sphere who has any interest whatsoever in learning about Michael Jackson. However, I would argue that there is an addendum to that audience. An audience of any autobiography, especially, should at the very least be not only interested in the topic, but open-minded when it comes to that topic as well. And so I'm saying this because I think as Michael Jackson fans, most of us are not only interested in Michael, but we're open-minded to what he has to say and understanding why he said it or didn't say it. When it comes to reviews, again, they can speak to craft, they can speak to execution if they wish to, but they should absolutely, at the very least, be interested in Michael Jackson and open-minded, meaning not going into reading this book with a preconceived idea as to what they will read and what that means. You might even think of it this way, because when we get into these reviews, you're going to get angry. At least if you're like me, you're going to get angry. You may have heard the phrase. I'm saying may have because if you're an international listener, perhaps you haven't. But there's a phrase we use in the US, and I think in a lot of English-speaking countries, to view something with rose-colored glasses, meaning we have a filter in front of us that shapes the way we view something before we even look at it. So with rose-colored glasses, we're seeing everything through this hue of beauty. Our expectation is beauty, so therefore we see it as beautiful. When we look at something from Michael Jackson, most of us fans look at something with an open-mindedness and open-heartedness because we want to understand him. We're not necessarily looking for whatever we read or consume to fulfill our expectations of him. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do that. We may be looking and hoping and trying to see things that reaffirm what we already believe about him. That is certainly true, and I can't pretend it's not possible that I do that as well. I'm sure that I do. But the same is to say that critics, unless they themselves are once again interested and open-minded about Michael Jackson, many of them from the mainstream media are going to be reviewing books with a closed mind, or at the very least with a filter over their view that is leading them to view Michael in a negative light. So not offering grace or goodwill to how we perceive the things he says or does. So this is all a long-winded way of talking about the importance of audience when it comes to writing and assessing. So we'll get into the review portion of that in a second, because I think this is all important context to keep in mind. But when it comes to assessing a book, part of what you're looking for is, was it effective at achieving what it set out to do? And the only way you can know that is by assessing who it was trying to reach. So if this book was trying to reach everyone, I'm not sure that it could, because as I said, if people are not approaching someone like Michael Jackson with an openness and a willingness and an interest in learning from him, and they go into it with preconceived ideas about him, then it won't be effective. But it will and potentially can be effective for people who are going into it as the ideal audience. So What do I think was Michael's goal? I think Michael's goal was pretty evident toward the end of the book. He said this a couple of times throughout, how he feels he is misunderstood, how he feels he has an image that it doesn't really match who he is, but what can he do about that? By the end, he is saying, I really don't feel comfortable with this, but I want people to feel they know me a little bit better. If his goal was for us to know him a little bit better, what do you think? I think we know him a little bit better. I think we know a little bit more about the way he thinks, about the things he's experienced, the things that have shaped him. I mean, I have done my quite a grand scale of psychoanalyzing this man for the last 4 months. I mean, much longer than that, but on the podcast at least, for the last 4 months in regard to this book. And so I do feel I learned more about him. But one thing I want to mention, and this is important for me, is that the things we learn about Michael are not limited to biographical information. So often, when people read a biography of someone, what they want is the individual recollections of experiences and stories that make up a life. But the undercurrent of how the story is told is often where we can learn the most and gain the most insight into someone. So while we learned biographical information about Michael, the biggest moments of his life, in terms of his career and his public-facing image, what isn't as evident in the biological recollection of his life is that beneath all of these experiences that he had, beneath the journey to become the greatest entertainer of all time, is a boy, a child, and eventually a man who over and over and over throughout this book reminds us that he believed and he operated in his life with the belief that he existed to serve, to please, to entertain, and to make other people happy. Now, as fans, he totally does that, right? I mean, he makes us all very happy. And we enjoy him, and he is the escapism for a lot of us that he hoped he could be. And I think that's beautiful on one hand. It's a beautiful goal to want to show up in the world in that way and give back to the world in that way. But if you go a little bit deeper than just his role as an entertainer, and okay, that's his career, a deeper narrative, if I were to kind of hone in on some of the deeper narratives that are not, just recollections of what we already know about his flawed relationship with his dad and his struggle with fame and all of that. If I were to go deeper, I would say that one of the biggest themes of this book that becomes evident the longer you analyze it is that Michael struggled to divorce himself as an individual from his self as a public figure, to the point that in some ways his life and image were a work of art. And you could argue, and I might argue myself, that that is a big part of the problem of his life. And the biggest strain on his life was that he, in his body, in his human form, he believed his role on this planet was not just to entertain the masses, but that his role as a man and as a person and his individual worth as a human being, stripping away everything else about him, all he existed for was for the happiness of others. I don't think if you were to remove the romantic view of that, through the rose-colored glasses, we can look at that as this beautiful thing about the kind of entertainer he became. But on a human level, that's not really a very healthy way to view yourself. And I think this really hit me when reading about the Pepsi incident, in which he nearly dies, but he's thinking about how to get a photo taken with the glove. In that moment, in a moment of absolute crisis, he was thinking about his image. And I don't believe that means he is a superficial person. A negative view of him, a nefarious view of him would suggest that that's what that means. I don't believe that. I think instead, this speaks to his overall psychology, which drove him to behave in such a way in both his personal and professional life to think more about other people and their well-being than himself. This is seen in how hard he worked himself, how much he would push and force himself to perform even when he was not healthy, as he did in later years of his life. How trapped he sort of became in the role of being famous, the role of being an entertainer that people had such expectations of. He was never unkind to his fans. He was never putting up barriers and boundaries to his fans that would have benefited him had he done that. He remained and made himself available in so many ways while trying to maintain privacy. And I can't imagine that the divide between who he was as a public figure and how he actually lived as a human being was very possible to keep. Michael's humility and gratitude for his success and for everything he had and his respect for his audience, all of those things are amazing qualities to have, but can they be taken to an extreme? Maybe. And maybe that is one of the things that when you're reading a book that ends when Michael's 29 and then he lives until he's 50, there are themes that you can see from this book that we can identify in his later years that became a more pronounced problem as he got older. And the idea of seeing himself almost in some ways as a product and as a figure to be bought and sold by people in order to achieve this kind of happiness for them because that was his role in life. It's almost like self-exploitation, but I want to be clear, I'm not blaming him for this. I'm not saying he actually exploited himself. What I'm trying to articulate here is that I think Michael viewed himself with less compassion than he would view any other human being, because he felt that just by the nature of existing, he owed something to the world. And I'm saying all this in part because when I, or even the reviewers I'll share, critique this book for not being as revelatory as maybe we want, or even as some reviewers say is dull or boring because it doesn't reveal more, there is an implicit sense of we deserve this from him. He owes us this. And that kind of is what I was getting into a little bit earlier when I was talking about why do we even think the story of his looks changing matters so much? And it's because the flip side of believing you exist to entertain and please the world is that the world will be predatory towards you and it will take that from you. And to be fair, the world would probably have done that anyway. But I think that Michael became even more of a victim in some ways of that because he himself viewed himself that way as well. So it became harder for him to speak out and defend himself or open up and have people respect that about him, because the world didn't see him as human first. They saw him as entertainment first, a source of entertainment. And so I want to be self-critical even of my own desire to have him reveal more. Now, on one hand, I think it is fair that in an autobiographical work, we would want a certain amount of revelation because that is the nature of the genre. But I also think there's no measure for what is the appropriate amount of sharing or not. So the expectation we create for if someone is sharing enough, sharing too much or too little or not enough or whatever is based in part on how we view that individual person. Does that make sense? So it's not just, oh, it's an autobiography, he should be revealing more by the nature of the genre. It's sure, but what do we expect someone to do? Do we want and expect public figures to, as I've said this about my own writing before, fillet themselves, like everything there? Is that the expectation? I don't think it ought to be. So what is a fair expectation in terms of how much a person reveals about themselves, and who is the judge of what is enough to reveal and to be considered a good autobiography? And if you have a public that views you as being boundaryless and they feel entitled to everything and anything about you, then no amount will be enough. And I think that has been evidenced throughout Michael's life and his posthumous legacy. Nothing about Michael is ever enough for the public. Michael can break every record set by every other person, and it's still not enough because they have an expectation for something else from Michael Jackson. And to some degree, this must be an unavoidable or an inevitable part of fame, which Michael does get to at the end of this book. And he talks about having his schedules printed, and he talks about having no sense of privacy at all. And I remember actually, I'm going to try not to laugh this time, in the Ebony Jet interview, which I reference all the time, when he is asked about if he ever regrets being so famous, and Michael says, no, but I would like to have, a little bit more privacy, but I shouldn't complain. The interviewer interrupts him and says, no, but everyone has the right to be alone. And Michael says, but it's part of the work. And so Michael had this expectation, this sort of foregone conclusion about himself, that he would never have those things, that there were certain things he just did not have access to or right to. And by the time he got much older, by the time he reached toward the end of his life, I get the sense that he wanted to withdraw and not be as famous and keep more just for himself and kind of not give the public as much as he had previously given. But even in death, there's seemingly nothing that the public won't consume about Michael and that the media won't exploit about him. I would say, to sum up, thematically, one of the most profound things I got from this particular reading of this book was the reminder that Michael saw himself as an entity that existed for the pleasure and entertainment of others. And while I think his intentions were pure-hearted with that, the deep psychology within him that brought him there, outside of course, feeling spiritually destined and everything, I'm talking about the deep psychology that comes with that, which can stem from child abuse and early exposures to fame and whatnot. That deep psychology is what I think allowed him in some cases to be so vulnerable to the outside world. And I think the outside world, in terms of media and public, are all too comfortable exploiting and taking from anybody that they can. And it's kind of like a vulture situation. But instead of a bird feeding from a corpse, it's a bird that first runs someone over so that they have something to eat. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, the media and public exploit Michael so much to the point of destroying him just so they have something to feed off of. I've often thought this actually when Michael wrote, people always make fun of the line from Wanna Be Starting Something, you're a vegetable, you're a buffet and they eat off of you. People make fun of that, but I think that's a brilliant line in the sense that, like, you are not only a vegetable, like a food that people are feeding from, but a vegetable in that, in the mindset of you are not able to move or do anything to speak up for or stand up for yourself. You're literally frozen while people are feeding from you. And that's kind of what it's like. Anyway, that got really dark and deep, more than I expected to in a review of Moonwalk. But all of that is to bring us to the reviews of this book. So I will conclude with my own, and to first say, I love this book. Is it a perfect book? No. Are there things I wish were different about it? Absolutely. But am I willing to contest that I, like anyone else, may need to evaluate my own expectations for this book and what I want from it and why I want those things? Sure. So overall, I love this book. I've read this book several times. I know I will continue to read it several more times. I enjoy being in Michael's head and I miss him when I'm not. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. I really love to reread it and gain new insight from it, learn more about it, learn more from Michael. All of that was a wonderful experience for me. And I believe this book is absolutely required reading for any Michael Jackson fan. But I think it's helpful to go into it with the mindset of Michael was creating this book to be more understood while also trying to protect some very small part of himself that he wanted to keep safe from the public, when at the same time he struggled with viewing himself as a commodity for the public to enjoy. So it's complicated. It's psychologically riveting when you look at it in that respect, but obviously there's limitations to what we'll learn. That is where I would end with my own review. But to bring in the critical voice, which I do think is useful, especially when thinking about how will this book translate to the screen when it comes to a biographical telling of Michael's life going into a film. So The primary review I want to touch upon is from 1988 in the New York Times. This was written by who I believe is a music critic named Ken Tucker, and he wrote this as part of like a summer book series or something. And he titled the review, "Firing Your Father Isn't Easy." So this was a review, of course, that came out shortly after the release of the book. And so it kind of speaks to how some of the mainstream media was responding to this book that Michael put out. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because that would be both tedious and unpleasant. But I am going to draw attention to a couple of major points he addresses. So this review starts out on a pretty snarky foot, I would say. He opens it by saying, "What can one say about Michael Jackson?" asks his editor, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, in her introduction to the autobiography. Since Mrs. Onassis' introduction takes up all of one short paragraph, the implied answer would seem not much. And indeed, the same question seems to have stumped the book's author, who fills pages with drab showbiz cliches and aimless anecdotes. So it doesn't start off well, right? And it's just interesting to me because I certainly don't interpret the short forward that way. And I certainly don't interpret anything Michael wrote as aimless showbiz cliches, right? I mean, none of that would be in my criticism of this book. He goes on to say, if this were written by anyone else, it could be dismissed as an assiduously unrevealing, frequently tedious document. So here, I just want to stick a pin in this and go back to my comment on ideal audience. Does any person with a vested interest in Michael Jackson actually find Moonwalk to be a boring book, to be tedious to read? No. I mean, I think I can speak for the collective when I say, if you're interested in Michael Jackson, this isn't tedious. And I'm not quite sure what about this is tedious. I mean, it's not even 300 pages. You know, it's like 285 pages with a ton of photos throughout. So realistically, more like 240, 250 pages. I mean, it's not long. It can hardly be seen as tedious, in my opinion. But then he goes on to compliment Michael as prodigiously talented as a singer, a dancer, choreography, songwriter, and record producer, and how successful he is. However, he then goes on to claim that many people will be reading this not because of Michael's talent as an artist, but because of his eccentricity. And then he provides some examples of that eccentricity, like wearing one jeweled glove. And he quotes Michael saying, "I felt that one glove was cool. Wearing two gloves seems so ordinary." The regular repairs to his appearance, which I don't appreciate the phrasing of personally, because I mean, repair implies something was broken and there was nothing broken about his appearance. He simply wanted to change it. Nevertheless, he then of course quotes Michael saying he's only had a couple of nose jobs. But then he says, and his exaggerated fondness for his pet monkey, and then quoting, "My chimp Bubbles is a constant delight." And this is how I'm immediately clued in with this writer. He's not approaching Michael Jackson with an openness or a sense of grace when it comes to believing in anything that Michael writes as sincere. I mean, he literally is saying his exaggerated fondness for his pet. That's to me how this immediately clues you in that this review is a little bit petty. Because in what world is someone exaggerating their fondness for an animal they love and care for by saying they're a constant delight? You know what I mean? So this is just an example of like finding a flaw where a flaw doesn't really exist. Then he goes on to say, but you know, he may address these various things, but he doesn't address the widely publicized attempt to buy the remains of the Elephant Man. And then he says, and this really bothered me, he said, "Even Mr. Jackson, as much a master of deadpan banality as Andy Warhol was, can't seem to muster an intentionally dull line to muffle the oddness of that." And this annoys me because I feel like it is painting Michael's entire approach to writing in Moonwalk, where maybe he doesn't have some extraordinary reason he wore one glove, but he paints that as nefarious, as if Michael's hiding something about himself by simply saying that the reason he wore one glove is he thought it was cool to wear one glove. Maybe the answer really is that simple, but if you go into reading a person's autobiography, assuming they're going to lie to you or assuming they're withholding from you, then you're going to be critical of stuff like this, and that's the part that bothers me about it. But then he goes on to say something I think is kind of offensive. He says, because to him, as in to Michael, a book like this is just another commercial for the self, a plug for his latest product, which in this case is his current album, Bad. Which the irony of this is that he barely talks about Bad. I mentioned that in the last episode. He barely talks about Bad. I mean, he certainly isn't satisfying a public interested in Bad, if he doesn't talk about it really at all. But again, there's this presumption of like, he's only doing this as this superficial, vapid effort to promote his book. As if, first of all, every celebrity writing an autobiography isn't doing it as a means of self-promotion. I mean, everyone writes and publishes things as a means of self-promotion. I don't really know why that would be looked down upon. But at the same time, isn't it possible to be wanting to self-promote while also wanting to be understood and wanting to have people see a new side of you? And so along these lines, this reviewer calls out Michael's criticism of the press, quoting when he said, "What happened to truth? Did it go out of style?" And that he simply doesn't want to give the press any more ammunition. So within that, he says, just because he signed a contract with a publisher for an autobiography doesn't mean he felt the need to reveal anything about himself. So again, I come back to the question I had earlier. What exactly do we want from something like this? What level of possibly self-effacing revelation do we actually want from someone? And I'm not just saying this to blindly support Michael Jackson or to blindly defend something that I myself found criticism of, where I wanted more depth. I'm not just saying this to blindly defend him. I'm genuinely asking, why do we expect such revelation from a person like Michael, who lived his whole life in the public eye? Why do we expect it? And to what end do we expect it? Like, what are we waiting to hear about? What would satisfy the people waiting in the wing to read this? What would be enough? And I'm not sure that the author would even know the answer to that question, because Michael does talk about child abuse. He talks about his struggle with himself and his insecurities. He talks about how difficult it was to basically not have a childhood or any time off. He talks about how painful it is to be misunderstood in the press and how much he feels like he's been disconnected from life experiences he should be having already. He does reveal things. So my frustration at times, I think, comes from a place of, as a fan, it's like there's nothing I don't want to know about him. But why is it that even his critics feel that way about him? Because from a fan perspective, it's like, I love him, I'm interested in him, I'm invested in understanding him. Why do his critics have such a thirst for that about him as well? That's interesting to me. But the one thing I do like about this review is that as much as this author is being critical of Michael's book, he is also saying there is a center of gravity. That's the term I would use when teaching, when studying memoir and autobiography and things like this. There should be a center of gravity for a narrative. What is that? And this reviewer identifies that center of gravity as Michael's relationship with his father. He specifically identifies in this a large paragraph in the middle of the review, he identifies multiple references to Michael's very strained relationship with Joseph, where he says, if you got messed up, you got hit, sometimes with a belt, sometimes with a switch. I got it more than all my brothers combined. My father would kill me, just tear me up. He later says, my father's something of a mystery to me. He later says, my whole family embraces a lot except for my father. He's the only one who doesn't. He goes on to talk about how firing Joe wasn't easy. So the reviewer concedes that the cliches, as he calls them, suddenly take an unexpected emotional force. You can sense the son's confused feelings of relief, anger, and regret. I appreciate that he draws this out because I tend to agree. I think that is one of the centers of gravity of the book, but along with some of the other points I already previously mentioned in this review. So I think that that's a good point that people can draw out of this. But again, why is that not enough? Why is revealing that and all of those things not enough? I don't quite understand what we're looking for at this point. But continuing on, he talks about how Michael sees himself in line with mainstream artists and entertainers, people he would recall as the real showman, rather than seeing himself as this kind of rebellious force within the music industry. I feel like that's a pretty obvious point of view, but I sort of appreciate this one line because I think it's meant with some flattery. He says, in general, standard artistic and social distinctions, high art versus low, sophistication versus vulgarity, mean nothing to Mr. Jackson, whose best music simply transcends these conventions. I like this part because I do think this centers on something that I've tried to articulate in the past about Michael and his appeal. Michael was the biggest entertainer of all time, biggest pop star of all time. So he was at the epicenter of pop music and what you would call commercial success. And yet there was a high value and high craft to his art, which would make it exist somewhere in the center between the commercial and the high art. You can even say that his sexuality on stage was somewhere between sophistication and vulgarity, because of course, a sophisticated performer may not, as some critics might say, grab their crotch or thrust and do all the things that Michael did. But the way he did it, the execution of it was never vulgar either. So he existed somewhere in that middle as well. So it kind of, as much as I feel like there are some veiled insults in that line, there is also a bit of an appreciation for how Michael manages to transcend being categorized in either high art or low art, in either sophistication or vulgarity. He's able to be mass appealing in a way that does not really put off critics, but also isn't going to alienate the masses. I find that interesting. Still, there's these snide remarks throughout this whole review. Like he says, the man who says he feels the most at home on stage, his highest praise for his fans is that they'll do whatever they tell you. That's not true. I mean, in the same section, he talks about how he tells his fans, you are doing something incredible. Like, look at what you're doing and creating in this uniting moment. He's not, the highest praise is certainly not, they'll do whatever you want. The highest praise is they are able to achieve that connection through sharing the space with me. Like he thinks highly of them in that regard. He also talks throughout the whole book about his desire to make people happy and please them and get great feedback from them and give them escapism. And he wants to make people happy. That's not somebody who doesn't think highly of his audience. It's somebody who respects his audience and wants to give them the best he possibly can. Finally, he ends this review with saying, in the end, it seems like Elvis Presley, his only equal in pop culture status, Michael Jackson is a supremely gifted and beloved artist who is held captive by his upbringing, by his fame, by his power, by himself. And I can't say I disagree with that line, because that is the conclusion I come to some degree with this book. But it's not about the book, though. It's about the fact that this was Michael's life. Michael's life was this sort of performance in which he was held captive by his own psyche, by his fame, by his fans, by the media, by the boxes he was put into and not allowed to escape ever, including when he goes into the 90s and becomes more rebellious in his work, when he starts to make more outright political statements and starts to stand up for the things he believes in more and to make some noise and speak out against injustice. Those are all things he continues to do, but then he gets criticized in different ways for them. So, Michael was never really given the credit that he deserved, in my opinion. And so this review I found very frustrating to read, but at the same time insightful, because to an average New York Times reviewer, revealing child abuse, revealing psychological struggles, those things were not enough of a revelation to satisfy him, but they were enough to criticize him and to find fault in everything from how he described his love for his pet monkey to how he described coming up with the idea to wear one glove. I get that we might want more, but is that fascination coming from a place of genuine interest, or is it coming from a place of control? Like, you owe us more than you're giving us. So here, us with our hand out, we're expecting more. Do you know what I'm saying? So that was the first one. But then I decided to read another, what I thought was a review, and it actually isn't quite a review, but more of like a news story about the re-release of this book in 2009. So this article was written in July 28th, 2009, the making of memoir, Jackson, Jackie, and Moonwalk. And so in this article, it reveals, and this is something I did not know, which is that only a week after Michael died, the executors of his estate, they reached out to publishers only a week after Michael died to republish this book, to take advantage of the moment and the renewed interest in him after he died. And I find that to be incredibly grotesque and just disgusting. So I'm not thrilled with that. And I didn't know it. I'm not surprised by it, but I'm not thrilled with it. But then it goes on in this article to mostly talk about the experience of this book being written. They do have this snide comment, kind of like Moonwalk is a classic celebrity project. It was not written or even conceived by Jackson, which is like mostly true, to be fair, in that he didn't come up with the idea to do this. And he did work with a ghostwriter. But they go on to say it topped the New York Times hardcover nonfiction list, but within a few years was forgotten and out of print. And I hate that they include this because it makes it sound like it was somehow this like failure on his part. I don't know. I feel like that's an unnecessary detail, as if, you know, an autobiography that comes out of a 29-year-old would still feel relevant to the public when that person's, I don't know, 35. It wouldn't really. I mean, it wouldn't feel as relevant because you want to stay up to date with what a person's story is. And with Michael, of course, his story really evolved a lot in the early 90s. So I don't know. I just find it kind of petty, I guess. But there are some nice comments here about Michael. They talked to Shay Earhart, who was the editor that we had heard from when we read the afterword, actually, the very start of this season. And she was quoted as saying about Michael that he was smart and funny and gracious, lively and an in-touch guy, and that he got along very well with Jackie Kennedy, who thought he was so sweet. And then Earhart does go on to say as well that the biggest challenge was not because he was difficult to work with, but because he was constantly touring, recording, or otherwise being Michael Jackson. His time was constantly not his own, she said. So I'm including all of this because the other review that I read was written in 2019, which you can imagine why I'm sharing this, was written post the release of the Leaving Neverland documentary. So this article was published in The Telegraph, written by Alice Vincent. And let me just tell you, it is a horrific article in that it is incredibly unkind to Michael, but it is relevant to think not only is this how people reviewed and understood this book, it is definitely a similar media narrative that we might be able to expect when it comes to the biopic. So she starts this review with honestly probably the only part I find completely true. She says, it's difficult to picture Michael Jackson as ever being in charge of his own narrative. I agree with that. It is difficult to picture a time when Michael Jackson was ever not dehumanized and disregarded and disrespected by the media, where people were not constantly feeding a narrative that painted a different picture of him than what was his reality. That aside, she continues saying, in 2019, the king of pop has been reduced to a sinister recluse, holed up in an enormous, echoing playground built to entertain, and it is alleged, lure children. So, yeah, that makes me very angry, but it also is kind of comical because she wrote this in 2019 and it is 2026 and we are a week out from a biopic being released, which I can confidently say will certainly be a massive, massive success for Michael and his legacy. So with that said, let's continue here. Despite what we just read in the previous article about how much people enjoyed working with Michael and how sweet he was and how liked he was, this article paints a completely different picture about how Michael was horrible to work with, how he was difficult, how he wouldn't give anything, how the drafting process was terrible. Now, is it possible all of that is true, that it was difficult? Sure, maybe. But the framing of it is what I'm referring to. Because frankly, this entire review of the book tries very hard to look at every single thing Michael said and did through the lens of viewing him as not only bizarre and weird and inhuman, but also as a sexual predator. So there's basically nothing he can say without them painting in a certain way to make it sound ridiculous. It says it rattles through his upbringing in Gary, which I think that sounds like a negative spin on what I thought were very engaging and interesting chapters. The reader is dragged through the making of Off the Wall and Bad. And in between, there are bland statements about his affection for people, such as Liza Minnelli and Diana Ross, and strange defensive interjections about his relationships with women and plastic surgery. Now, I will concede that toward the end of the book, Michael does come across a little defensive when it comes to plastic surgery. I'll concede that. But how was him describing his difficulty connecting with women as defensive? The specific section in which he talks about his relationship with women, he uses the song She's Out of My Life and his inability to really have the significant long-term relationship he wanted as an opportunity to open up about his struggles with relationships and how he struggles to meet someone who doesn't try to get into his head and try to join him in his loneliness, as he put it. That does not come across as defensive. It came across as sad, right? It was sad to think of his inability to connect. But the way this reviewer writes it, if you did not read the book, it would come across as if he was declaring, oh, hey, no, I did have relationships with women. No. And it's just not the nature of how it was actually written. But if you're looking at this, believing or wanting to reinforce the idea that he was not interested in women, then that is how you would frame it. But notice, like I said, all the language here about rattling through, dragging us through, bland statements, strange defensive interjections. Every single thing is framed in the negative. Everything. She then goes on to tell some story about how when Jackie Kennedy wanted to get this published, the publishers didn't know who Michael Jackson was. I'm just going to let that hang in the air for a moment. We're talking about like 1984. So we're going to pretend that anyone in the world didn't know who Michael Jackson was at that point. Okay. And then goes on to say that Jackie thought Michael was a freak, that she found his bedroom surreal, his collection of animals were weird. Again, these are not real accusations. This is cheap. This is tabloid fodder, and it's not based at all in the book that we read. So it's just another opportunity the media is taking to trash him, basically. But this part I do find interesting, especially in light of, again, my own review and our own reading of this book. She says, reading Moonwalk now, as in 2019, it's interesting to see the beginnings of the myth-making that would preserve Jackson's innocence until his death. His insistence on being a living Peter Pan, a child trapped inside the body of a grown man, was integral to the legacy of Neverland, where Jackson would say that his favorite things to do were climb trees and engage in water fights. Much of Moonwalk recalls the hijinks Jackson and his brothers engaged in while on the road as a band. And then she goes on to describe his various little pranks that he did with his brothers. And this I find fascinating because as I said in my review, Michael says several times in this book that he feels like an old soul. He feels older than he is and older than his years, that he likes to spend time with children so he can reconnect with his own inner child. At no point in this book, which is the thing she's supposed to be reviewing, at no point in this book does he actually talk about feeling like he was a child inside. Now, of course, he did go on after this book to buy Neverland, and he did make statements about loving childlike things and about loving water fights and climbing trees. I mean, he made those statements, and there's nothing wrong with him making them. But my point is that it's twisting. It's using this 2019 narrative to twist and revise our understanding of what the actual book said. And it didn't say those things, and it certainly didn't imply them. If anything, it gave context to understanding why he might feel a sense of desire to reconnect with his inner child because he didn't have any opportunity to when he was young. But that would be the gracious review, right? Where as we came in later years of Michael's life to understand that he did seek to reconnect with his inner child, reading this book can tell us and give us an explanation as to why he needed that. So yeah, again, it's just written in this way that really lacks any kind of nuance at all when it comes to him. But then she gets darker even still. She says, there are traces of the alleged cover-ups to come. Jackson's anticipated admissions about his girlfriends amount to, there have been a lot of wonderful women in my life, women whose names wouldn't mean a thing to the readers of this book, and it would be unfair to discuss them. So she cites this as like, because he didn't want to out the names of women that he was involved with, as that is a cover-up somehow, which it would be much easier for Michael to actually have a cover-up girlfriend than to make up anonymous women, but okay. And then it says, perhaps the one thing Moonwalk explores most enthusiastically is Jackson's affection for children, for whom the book claims he wrote Beat It. And then it quotes the few times in the book he actually does talk about children. Their approval means more to me than anyone else's. It's always the kids who know which song is going to be a hit. And there always seems to be a bunch of kids over at the house, and they're always welcome. They energize me and just being around them. They look at everything with fresh eyes, such open minds. They only demand that they be treated fairly and to be loved. So somehow, those specific comments I read are the ones that she is pointing to as evident of a cover-up that he was a pedophile. So Michael simply enjoying the presence of children. And keep in mind, at this point, when this was written, he didn't even have Neverland yet. So the kids around were more than likely his relatives' kids and their friends. But also, there's nothing nefarious about any of these comments. They are very benign comments about his enjoyment of children. Nothing about this is creepy. Nothing about it is weird. But if you intentionally go into viewing something a certain way, you will find evidence to support that perspective. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring all of this up. There's so much more to this review that I don't even want to touch at this point because it honestly just makes me so angry. But for me, I thought it was important to include these things because, like I said, reading Moonwalk in some ways is going to prepare us for watching this biopic. From what we understand about the biopic, it covers the early years of the Jackson 5 up until the Bad Tour, or the start of the Bad Tour. In essence, it covers the same narrative arc as Moonwalk. Yet, as we see in these reviews we've looked at, there's this expectation from the media that there's more that should be revealed in this story of Michael's life. Now, in my opinion, this is my opinion, in a biopic made about a human being who really lived, it makes sense to base a lot of the narrative structure off of the autobiography that individual wrote in their lifetime. As I said many times throughout this season, I see no reason to believe other people's narratives about Michael more than his own about himself, especially when it comes to things that are not provable or things that there's no evidence for whatsoever. It makes sense to me that you would go based on someone's own account of their own life. So I would imagine that the narrative structure of the film will follow a very similar one to what we saw in Moonwalk, which to me sounds wonderful because that's the story that Michael told in his lifetime. That's the story we know is based on his reality. Now, what I would like to see in the film is not only the depiction of the things he talks about here, but an expansion on them. So I would like to see the extent of whatever was going on in his home life with his father and what kind of physical discipline or violence or abuse, however you think about it. I would like to see that. Not because I actually want to see it. I'm not a psycho, but because I think it's important for a viewer to understand that. I also want to see the depiction of him performing in nightclubs around strippers. Again, I don't like it, but I think it's important for a viewer to understand Michael, to see that these were his early informative experiences. I hope that all of these things that Michael talks about, where he's the one who stands up to Berry Gordy about wanting to leave Motown, I hope that's represented. I hope Michael's songwriting and all the effort he personally put into the creation of Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad is really evident because there are so many people who doubt his writing abilities and, the work that he put into it as well. I want an emphasis on how hard he worked, how much his life was dedicated to this, and I want definitely an emphasis on his humanitarian work, which these reviews, I notice, ignore in reviewing Moonwalk. They leave that part out conveniently. I want all of that, but I also want more. So I don't know that the biopic can only follow Moonwalk and be the best biopic it could be. I think it would be great to fill in additional gaps. And I would love, personally, some exposure about his relationships because I think it is important that people see an actual face to the women that Michael had a connection with. I think it would be a disservice to Michael to not include anything about his romantic involvement with various women that he connected with in his young life, especially figures like Diana Ross, who I have personally vouched in my belief that they had a romantic relationship. I would like to see that depicted. I do not expect it to be because it's not part of an established narrative about Michael that I think Michael's family or the estate is comfortable with. And I'm not going to say, I could be wrong also, I'm not saying I know more. It's what I think. I would like all of those things to be evidenced. I want more than anything for Michael to simply be humanized in this film, to be seen and appreciated for being a human being above all else. I really, really want that. That's very deeply important to me in this film. So that's all of my hope. But that's what he attempted to do in Moonwalk. Again, maybe he lacked some details in certain places. Maybe he could have revealed more. Okay. But that's what he attempted to do in Moonwalk. And that was mocked and disrespected by the media, who felt they deserved more from him. They wanted more revelation from him. And then when you have the post Leaving Neverland media, like the one I read about in 2019, you have a media machine that is looking at Michael Jackson in this biopic with the intention of promoting this idea of a mass cover-up from Michael's end, where he was this horrible person that nobody knew was the case. So it doesn't matter if the true story of Michael Jackson is that he was exactly who he presented himself to be in Moonwalk. What matters to the media is whether or not Michael is fitting their narrative, which I would connect to my previous point about everyone wanting Michael Jackson to serve a certain end to them, to provide something to them, whether that is entertainment or escapism or pleasure or a means of making money. For whatever reason, the media continues to reinforce this idea that you cannot make money with a positive portrayal of Michael Jackson. That's simply not true. I think we find more and more times than not, positive portrayals of Michael Jackson actually do significantly better than the negative. But the media we've seen coming out since the biopic, in terms of like print press and everything, has not been super positive about it. So I'm saying all this, why? Well, I think we need to look at how Moonwalk was treated and the disregard for Michael's own narrative was treated. And we need to expect that for this biopic, that it is going to get criticized and it is going to be treated as if it's not telling the full story. But if you've ever been a person who's been accused of lying about something you didn't lie about, and the person accusing you simply wouldn't hear anything you had to say if it wasn't what they wanted to hear, then you know how frustrating this is. And that's how frustrating I feel this is. So what I think ought to be a celebration for Michael, for his fans, and for the world to get to re-experience some aspect of Michael Jackson's legacy and to celebrate that legacy, I do expect the media will try to tear it down and will try to reinforce an idea that this is not the true story. And that is very frustrating to me. But I don't want to linger on that any further. There's a few more points I want to make about Moonwalk, about the narrative there, and about the biopic as well. Rereading this book throughout the last 4 months has been a trip. It has been incredibly interesting and difficult at times, but overall a really satisfying and enjoyable journey. I feel like I've spent more time analyzing and sitting with Michael's life story in terms of biography than I have in a little while. And it is a shame to think that it ends when it does. And it's a shame to think that there's so much more to the story that we will never have Michael's point of view on. So while I fully expect this biopic to cover the time frame of Moonwalk and not much more, I do know it has been confirmed that there is a second film in the making. And that second film, I imagine, will cover times in Michael's life that we actually don't have Michael's own narrative to contribute to. So that will be very interesting to see how that is pieced together, how that is developed. But I am also confident that because it is being broken up into two films, which honestly happened and I think is a blessing because it means there's more time and space to devote to each side of Michael's life. I've always felt frustrated by the idea that a 2 or 3 hour biopic would have a significant portion about allegations because Michael was so much more than those allegations, not only on a musical career level, but as a human being. And it has always frustrated me. So I'm very actually relieved that there will be 2 films. I think that is for the best for Michael and his legacy and in what he deserves, as well as for the viewers to really learn about what really happened. I think that's a very positive development, and I'm super, super excited about that. So a few final words about Moonwalk. Although Moonwalk is the one and only autobiography that Michael released during his lifetime, it is not, in my opinion, his most autobiographical work that he released in his lifetime. In the past, Michael has said that his book, Dancing the Dream, which is the collection of poetry and essays and stories that he released in the early 90s and that I covered in all of season 1, he has said that this book is more autobiographical. And he also went on to say later that the History album, and specifically songs like Childhood, are some of the most autobiographical songs that he'd ever written. So I believe that as much as Moonwalk covers a lot about Michael's life, especially biographical info about specific dates and events and things that happened in his life and circumstances of his life, in terms of the emotional core, which is something you might expect more from, say, a memoir than an autobiography, those things I think are more present in his other work. That does not mean Moonwalk doesn't hold tremendous value. I think that it certainly does. But more than anything, I think to understand Michael Jackson, it is important that we look at the many sources and many things that he did right. So I feel a really strong desire right now to reread Dancing the Dream. Because when I first read Moonwalk and I read that he had said Dancing the Dream is more autobiographical, and then I read Dancing the Dream, I was like, I don't know that I get that. But then, of course, having read both multiple times and having spent time now, significant time with both books, I actually kind of agree. I agree. There's detailed information about the happenings of Michael's life in Moonwalk, but there's a deeper emotional core and representation of his inner self in Dancing the Dream. And which thing are we more interested in? Is it the details of his life or is it the details of his inner world? And I would say that we kind of get both if you merge these together. And I want to also remind readers when I say this that despite some of my criticisms, despite the criticisms here that I went through, Michael signed off on these books to be published. He signed off on Moonwalk to be published, even though it was uncomfortable for him. And as I shared in one of our first episodes this season, I think from the afterword in the book, Michael initially had the idea to create a book that was more like Dancing the Dream ultimately became. A book of photos, a book of short writing, and not necessarily this full-fledged narrative. Part of the reason Moonwalk exists in the form it does is because others wanted it to. Michael, of course, agreed to that and is a part of that, but it was not his original vision. So critiques of the actual end product don't necessarily reflect the fact that this was not Michael's original vision to begin with, you know? With that said, I think that there's so much to be gained from all of these deep dives and immersive experiences with Michael's work. I truly hope that you enjoyed this season and spending time doing that with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, which I know was very long and a very intense overview, and maybe not quite what you expected. I know it isn't quite what I expected, to be honest. But I hope that it has given you something to think about as we enter into biopic season. So whenever you listen to this, whether it's before or after you've seen the film, even if you're a future listener to this and listening to it many years later, I hope that these ideas I've shared and perspectives I've shared resonate in some way and give you something to consider when looking at Michael's life story. So to end this episode, I would like to share one final reading from Moonwalk. After chapter 6 ends and before the foreword, there's a brief statement by Michael that I did not read in the last episode, so I want to use that today to close. Michael writes, "What one wishes is to be touched by truth and to be able to interpret that truth so that one may use what one is feeling and experiencing, be it despair or joy, in a way that will add meaning to one's life and will hopefully touch others as well. This is art in its highest form. Those moments of enlightenment are what I continue to live for." If anything, I see this end quote as almost a bridge between Moonwalk and the work that is to come in the 1990s. Moonwalk, in a lot of ways, is the last release Michael had in the 80s, and it kind of encapsulates the 80s in that way, where Michael was a more distant figure. He was someone with a little more reservation. In the 90s, he attempted to open up more. He personalized his writing more. His writing became more autobiographical. His book, Dancing the Dream, was more autobiographical, according to him. Everything started to open up and change. So this quote we can see almost as that bridge between learning a truth and revealing a truth so that it can affect and touch others. I believe that even though my favorite Michael Jackson music is probably from the 1980s, I believe in a lot of ways, his best and most powerful work comes after, in the 90s. And so it'll be really interesting. And so it is my hope that in future seasons of reading Michael Jackson, we can spend some time further divulging and exploring some of the work that came later that was more representative of who he maybe was on a deeper level. But we will see. We are not quite finished yet with this season. So this episode is technically going to be a part 1 to the season finale. Part 2 will be coming after the release of the biopic, in which I give my review and thoughts on that film in relationship to what we learned about Michael in Moonwalk. So I'm really looking forward to that. I am scared. I am scared to watch the film, to feel all the feelings, and to have to talk about them. I am nervous. I'm going to try to avoid reading too many other reviews from the fans so that I am not influenced by anyone else's perspective, but we will see how well I hold up with that. In the meantime, I want to thank you for listening to this episode today. Again, I know it was very long, so thank you for joining and sticking it out with me. I am so excited for this biopic. I hope you are all just as excited as me. And please be sure to join me here. I hope next week. I'm still going to aim for. So please do your best to join me here when I release my next episode. I'm not quite sure when that will be. Most likely on a Tuesday after the biopic, but we'll see what I can pull off, people. Until then, though, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I hope that you spend some time thinking about what your own expectations are for this film from Jafar and from the culture around us that, on one hand, I think craves out and calls out to see Michael Jackson resurge, and on the other hand seems to be terrified of what that would mean if he did, and allowing it to even happen in the first place. So I hope you have spent some time contemplating all of this and go into this biopic with a brain full of insights and curiosities, but remaining open to whatever happens on that screen that tells us more, hopefully, about who this magical, magical man is. So thank you once again, and I will talk to you all again very, very soon. Until then, take care.